Rebecca had always thought her marriage was strong. She and Mark had been together for nearly 10 years, building a life that looked good from the outside, stable jobs. A quiet home in Oregon, occasional getaways, shared routines. But underneath, cracks had started to form. They rarely laughed anymore, barely touched. And the silence between them at night said more than words ever could. Then one evening, everything shifted. They were sitting in the living room, the fireplace burning low. Mark was unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on the flames. Rebecca had just poured them each a glass of wine when he finally spoke. "I've been thinking about something," he said slowly, not looking at her. "Something different." Rebecca tilted her head, unsure of where this was going. "Okay, what is it?" He hesitated. Then, in a voice lower than usual, he said, "I want to see you with someone else." Rebecca blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I want to watch," he said. "I want to see what it's like. To let go, to see you happy again." Her heart skipped. At first, she thought it was a joke. But the seriousness in his face told her it wasn't. Her mind raced. Mark had always been a calm, thoughtful man. This wasn't like him. She asked him why now? Why this? He looked at her, his eyes a strange mix of pain and hope. "Because I miss you. I miss us, I think. Maybe this is a way to break the wall between us." Rebecca sat in stunned silence. The idea sounded wild. Too strange, but also, a part of her listened. A quiet part that had felt distant from Mark for years. She couldn't deny that a longing had been growing inside her, a longing to feel seen, touched, desired. She had buried those feelings under responsibility and routine. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Mark nodded. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. No pressure." That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind wandered to places she hadn't dared go in years. What would it mean for her marriage? For her heart? She wasn't looking for someone else. But the idea of being wanted of, being seen again hit a nerve she didn't expect. Days passed. She didn't bring it up, but the silence between them became charged, full of unspoken thoughts. Then one night after dinner, she walked into the living room and said, "Okay, I'll do it." Mark looked up, surprised. "Are you sure?" "No," she admitted, "but I trust you." He gave a soft, unsure smile. "Thank you for even considering it." The next few days were quiet, strange. Mark made arrangements. Nothing rushed, nothing secretive. They talked about boundaries. He promised it wasn't about jealousy. It was about trust, exploration, and a chance to shake something loose between them. She agreed, but her nerves remained. Mark found someone through a friend, a man named Gabriel. He wasn't a stranger, exactly, but not someone Rebecca knew well. Mark said he was respectful, professional, and fully understood the situation. When the day came, Rebecca felt like she was walking through a dream. She dressed carefully, choosing something elegant but modest. She wasn't trying to seduce anyone. She just wanted to feel like herself again. Strong, calm, real. Mark stayed in another room. He said he didn't want to interfere, just to observe quietly. Rebecca walked into the softly lit living room and waited. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of water. Then the door opened. Gabriel walked in with a kind smile, dressed simply in a dark shirt and jeans. His presence was calm, grounded. He greeted her politely, almost too politely, and asked if she was okay. She nodded, though she didn't know if she meant it. They sat on the couch, both stiff at first. He spoke gently, asking about her day, her work, what she liked to read. The conversation was light, simple, but oddly comforting. Slowly, her shoulders relaxed. She wasn't expecting to laugh, but she did. Just once. A small, real laugh at a comment Gabriel made about how awkward this all was. "It feels like a weird first date in a movie," he said, grinning. Rebecca laughed again, surprised by the sound of it. From the other room, Mark heard it too. As the minutes passed, the tension in the room faded. Rebecca didn't know what she was feeling: excitement, fear. Maybe both. But she knew one thing for sure. She hadn't felt this alive in a long time. Gabriel wasn't pushy. He didn't touch her. He just listened. And Rebecca, for the first time in years, felt like someone saw her not as a wife, not as a role, but as a woman. A human being with thoughts, desires, and emotions. At some point, she looked toward the hallway, knowing Mark was there, watching. She wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling. But then Gabriel asked another question, and she turned back, drawn into the moment again. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. There was no physical line crossed, but emotionally, Rebecca knew she had walked into unfamiliar territory. And strangely, she wasn't ashamed. She was curious about herself, about her marriage, about what this meant. When Gabriel stood to leave, he shook her hand gently. "Thank you," he said softly, "for trusting this moment." She nodded, her heart racing as he walked out. Rebecca stood alone in the quiet room, unsure of what had just happened. She had expected discomfort, maybe regret. But what she felt instead was warmth. Then she heard Mark's voice from the hallway. "Rebecca." She turned slowly. He stepped into the light, looking at her carefully. She didn't know what he saw in her eyes, but she could tell, just by his face, that he hadn't expected her to enjoy it that much, and neither had she. The next morning, the house was quiet. Rebecca woke early, her mind still spinning from the night before. The soft light of dawn filtered through the curtains, but nothing about the day felt normal. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, hands wrapped around the mug, staring at nothing. Mark came downstairs later, slower than usual. His face was unreadable, tired, and serious. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "How do you feel?" Rebecca looked up, unsure how to answer. "Different," she said honestly. "I thought I'd feel guilty or ashamed, but I don't." Mark nodded slowly. "I saw you smile last night, in a way I haven't seen in years." His words hurt and warmed her at the same time. It was true. That spark, that lightness, it had been missing from her life. And last night, even in that strange situation, something inside her had awakened. "I didn't plan to enjoy it," she said. "But Gabriel was kind. He listened. He made me feel seen." Mark looked down at his coffee. "That's what scares me." Rebecca felt a weight in her chest. She reached for his hand across the table. "I didn't fall in love with him. I just remembered what it felt like to be wanted, to be interesting." Mark didn't pull his hand away. "I thought this would bring us closer," he said quietly. "But now I'm not sure." She squeezed his fingers gently. "It can, if we're honest about what we need." The day passed slowly. They stayed home, speaking softly, moving around each other with care. There was no anger, no yelling, just an uncomfortable tenderness between two people facing a truth they hadn't wanted to see. Their marriage had been coasting, quiet and polite, but lacking something deep. Later that afternoon, Mark stood in the doorway of Rebecca's studio, watching her clean up old paintbrushes. She turned when she noticed him, surprised. "I miss your art," he said. "You used to paint every weekend." "I stopped when I felt like nothing I made mattered anymore." Mark stepped inside, picking up a dusty sketchbook. "Maybe this experience reminded you that you matter." Rebecca nodded, surprised by how gently he said it. "It reminded me of who I was before life got small." Mark looked at her. "And who are you now?" She didn't have an answer. That night, Mark suggested they go for a drive. No destination, just a quiet road through the hills. They didn't speak much, just listened to the hum of the engine and watched the sun dip behind the trees. After a while, Mark pulled over at an overlook. They sat in silence, watching the sky fade to soft blue. "I was jealous," he said finally, "but not of him, of the version of you that came alive." Rebecca looked at him with wet eyes. "That version has always been here. I just didn't feel safe enough to be her." He turned toward her, voice cracking. "I want to be the man who makes you feel safe, who brings you back to life." She reached out and touched his cheek. "Then don't shut down now. We can rebuild this." If we're both willing. They drove home in silence, but the air between them felt less heavy. Something was opening painfully, slowly, but it was real. Over the next few days, things shifted. Mark asked more questions, not to accuse, but to understand. Rebecca answered honestly, even when the truth was hard. She admitted she had felt invisible, lonely, unappreciated. Not unloved, just unseen. Mark listened, really listened. For the first time in a long time, one evening, while folding laundry together, Mark said something that stopped her cold. What if Gabriel wasn't the end of this? What if he was the beginning of us learning what we've been missing? Rebecca looked at him, surprised. You'd be okay with more? I don't know, he said, but I'd rather explore this with you than pretend we're okay when we're not. She nodded slowly. I don't want to chase excitement. I want connection. Real, deep connection with you. He smiled, a tired but genuine smile. Then let's keep talking. No secrets. No hiding. And they did. Every night after dinner, they sat on the couch and talked about their past, their fears, their hopes. They didn't always agree. Sometimes the conversations ended in silence, sometimes in tears. But they were real. Rebecca didn't see Gabriel again. It hadn't been about him. He was just the mirror that reflected back what she was missing. What they were missing. Instead of chasing more outside of their marriage, Rebecca and Mark began building something new inside it. They started dating again, walks, dinners, long talks in coffee shops. Mark even bought her a new set of paints and encouraged her to start creating again. One morning, Rebecca found a note on her pillow. It was from Mark. Simple words, but they hit deep. I see you. I hear you. I love you. Let's keep finding each other. Tears filled her eyes as she held the note close. They weren't healed, not yet. But they were willing, and that was enough to start again. The days after their honest talks brought a new energy into Rebecca and Mark's life. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, no fireworks or grand declarations, but a quiet reawakening. They began to notice the little things again. The way Mark's hand brushed against Rebecca's as they passed in the kitchen. The soft smiles shared across the breakfast table. Slowly, the walls they had built around themselves began to crumble. Rebecca returned to her painting with passion. Every brushstroke felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost in the weight of their marriage's routine. Mark watched with pride, sitting beside her at the small studio table, offering gentle encouragement without pressure. Sometimes he'd glance at her and see that familiar spark in her eyes, a spark he had feared extinguished forever. One chilly evening, Mark surprised Rebecca with tickets to a small art exhibit downtown. It was nothing extravagant, just a quiet way to show he cared. They walked hand in hand through the gallery, surrounded by paintings and sculptures that spoke of passion and creativity. For the first time in months, they talked about their dreams again. Mark shared his long-forgotten desire to write a novel, something he had shelved to focus on work. Rebecca listened intently, excited by the idea of this new chapter. That night, driving home under a sky full of stars, Mark reached over and took Rebecca's hand. I want to be part of your world, he said simply. Not just your husband, but your partner in everything. Rebecca squeezed his hand back, heart swelling with hope. I want that too. Despite the renewed closeness, the past still lingered quietly between them. Rebecca sometimes caught herself wondering if Mark really understood how lonely she had felt. Or if he was simply trying to patch a fragile surface. Mark, on his side, battled his own fears. What if this closeness was temporary? What if they fell back into silence and coldness again? One afternoon, they sat in the living room, sunlight pouring through the windows. Rebecca brought up something that had been on her mind. Last week when Gabriel was here, I realized it wasn't about him. It was about me wanting to feel alive again. Mark nodded slowly. I think I was scared. Scared that I wasn't enough for you? She reached out, touching his face gently. You are. But I needed to remind both of us that we have to keep choosing each other. From then on, they made small promises. No phones at dinner. more time for conversation, intentional moments to connect. They began sharing their fears and hopes openly without judgment. One night, Mark cooked dinner, something he rarely did. The kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and rosemary, a warmth spreading through the house. Rebecca set the table, smiling at the effort. They ate slowly, savoring both the food and each other's company. After dinner, they settled on the couch, close but not yet touching. Mark reached out hesitantly and took Rebecca's hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like a language they had forgotten but still knew. The night grew deeper. The silence between them no longer heavy but full of possibility. Mark looked into Rebecca's eyes and saw the vulnerability and strength there. She saw the same in him, the man who had loved her quietly through years of distance, now trying to bridge the gap. They talked softly about the past, about mistakes made and lessons learned. Rebecca admitted she had sometimes felt invisible, like a shadow in her own life. Mark confessed how his fears of losing her had made him shut down. "I want to be better," he said, "for you." "For us," Rebecca nodded, tears welling. "Me too." Slowly, carefully, they moved closer. There was no rush, no pressure, just two people rediscovering each other's touch, learning again how to be close. That night was the first time in a long while they slept in the same bed without distance between them. Mark held Rebecca gently, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It felt safe. It felt right. Days turned into weeks. The awkwardness faded, replaced by a tenderness that grew stronger. They found comfort in simple rituals: morning coffee shared on the porch, evening walks through the neighborhood, quiet moments reading side by side. Rebecca began to open up more about her dreams. She talked about wanting to teach art to children, to inspire others the way she had once been inspired. Mark encouraged her every step, offering support and ideas. At work, Mark also made changes. He found more time for creative writing, carving out mornings to put words on paper before the day's demands took over. He shared snippets with Rebecca, who listened with pride. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park watching children play, Mark surprised her with a small wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound notebook. "For your art ideas," he said. "For everything you want to create." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." They kissed softly, the kind of kiss that spoke of new beginnings and unspoken promises. Yet, even in this growing closeness, challenges remained. Both knew healing wasn't linear. There were moments of doubt, fears resurfacing like shadows. Sometimes past wounds ached in the quiet. One evening, after a long day, Rebecca admitted she still felt scared. "What if we lose this again?" Mark pulled her close. "Then we'll fight for it. Every day. Together." Their renewed connection wasn't perfect, but it was honest. They were learning to trust again, to be vulnerable without fear. The house that once felt cold and empty now held warmth. It echoed with laughter, conversation, and the quiet sound of two people choosing each other. Rebecca and Mark's story was not about perfection, but about resilience. About the courage to face hard truths, to step into unknown emotional territory, and to rebuild a love that had been tested but not broken. And as they held each other close that night, with the city lights twinkling outside their window, both knew this was just the beginning. A new chapter written not with grand gestures, but with quiet, steady love. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding for Rebecca and Mark. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always smooth. But every day, they chose each other again. The old walls of silence and distance were slowly replaced by trust and understanding. Rebecca's art flourished. She began teaching weekend classes at a local community center, sharing her passion with children who reminded her of the young girl she once was, curious, hopeful, eager to create. Mark was her biggest supporter, often sitting in the back of the room watching her connect with her students. He saw a new light in her eyes, one that filled him with pride and relief. Their home felt alive again. They filled it with laughter, with music, with shared meals and quiet nights. They celebrated small victories, a completed painting, a new poem Mark wrote, a weekend spent just walking and talking. But the real test came when life's challenges crept back in. Work pressures, family demands, and everyday stresses threatened to pull them apart. Old fears tried to resurface, the fear of being alone, the fear of losing the love they had fought so hard to regain. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Rebecca sat on the porch steps, head in her hands. Mark joined her quietly, sitting close but giving her space. She looked up, tears in her eyes. "I'm scared, Mark. What if this all falls apart again?" He took her hand gently. "I'm scared too. But we can't let fear control us. We have to keep talking, keep being honest. That's how we'll stay strong." Rebecca nodded, feeling the truth in his words. They promised to never stop communicating, no matter how hard it got. Their commitment wasn't just about saving their marriage, it was about growing together, learning to be partners in every sense, not just in name. They found new ways to connect: regular date nights, weekend trips to quiet places, even silly things like cooking a new recipe together or watching old movies. One chilly autumn afternoon, they took a drive to a nearby lake. The trees were fiery reds and golds, the air crisp and fresh. They sat on a bench by the water, wrapped in a shared blanket. Watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mark looked at Rebecca. His eyes filled with warmth. "I never stopped loving you," he said softly. "Even when we were lost, even when I didn't know how to show it." Rebecca smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I love you too, and I'm ready to keep building this, no matter what." The lake was quiet, except for the soft sounds of water and wind. It felt like a promise that even after storms, there could be peace. Back home, they faced difficult conversations about boundaries, about past mistakes, about the future. But now those talks didn't break them. They brought them closer. Rebecca stopped thinking of her time with Gabriel as a betrayal and began seeing it as a turning point. A moment that forced her to face what she needed and speak her truth. Mark no longer saw it as a threat, but as a chance to understand her better. Together, they rewrote their story. A story not of blame or regret, but of growth, forgiveness, and hope. Their love became something quiet and strong. Not loud or dramatic, but steady and real. They learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply choosing each other every day, through the hard times and the good. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Mark surprised Rebecca with a small box. Inside was a simple ring, not a new engagement, but a symbol of their renewed commitment. "I want to keep choosing you," he said. "Not because I have to, but because I want to." Rebecca's eyes glistened with tears. "I choose you too. Every day." They held each other close, knowing the road ahead would still have bumps. But now they had a foundation strong enough to hold them, built on honesty, trust, and a love reborn from the ashes of heartbreak. Their story was far from perfect, but it was theirs. A story of two people who lost their way, found each other again, and dared to believe in a new beginning. And as they looked forward, hand in hand, they knew that, whatever came next, they would face it together.